Right. Mike, thanks so much for inviting me to give one of these. A lot of the ideas that I'll talk about today are in the What is Intelligence book, which Mike was super kind to blurb. But I'm going to give them a little bit of a new spin and go into some additional technical detail on the aspects of it that are, I think, most relevant, and focus mostly on things that are in chapter 1 of What is Intelligence, which is also the little What is Life book that's on the left. So this is mostly a chapter 1 thing, but I think in many ways chapter 1 is the most groundbreaking part of this book. Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to just I guess establish is the relationship between life and computation. I'm going to do it in 3 ways, via functionalism, via causality, and via the exigencies of reproduction. So first of all, let's look at the functionalist standpoint. So it used to be in the before the 19th century that people thought about life in terms of élan vital, or some kind of vital spirit that makes living systems different from non-living systems in terms of their underlying physics. That fell out of fashion, of course, as we began to figure out how to do things like synthesize urea and realize that the same physics underlie the atoms that make us up as make a chair up or something. So that went out of fashion, and we got materialism, which is still kind of where we are today. It's just physics and chemistry. It's the same physics and chemistry for us as for everything else. That is, as far as we know, true. But it actually leaves a pretty big open question, which is, what does make us different in that case from chairs? And I think in fact, I shouldn't actually use chairs as my example. I should use a rock on a lifeless planet. And I would say the thing that makes us different is function. If you take a rock on a lifeless planet and you break it in half, you don't have a rock that is broken. You just have 2 rocks now, because the rock didn't have some function. It wasn't being depended on for some purpose. And by way of counterexample, if you imagine that I have brought an object from the future that looks like this, and you ask me what that thing is, you're peering inside, you're seeing that it has carbon nanotubes and all kinds of complicated machinery inside, and I tell you it's an artificial kidney. If implanted in a human body, it'll have a 100-year lifespan. It'll do the same things that the kidney does. It'll filter urea. I've just told you about its function, and the reason this is important. Well, obviously, this really matters to you if you have, say, renal failure. It's a matter of life and death. But notice that by saying it's an artificial kidney, I've given you new information that was not somehow derivable from just the atoms in that kidney. Those atoms are subject to the same laws of physics and chemistry as anything else, and outside of the context of your body, it's not obvious what they are for or what they do or what is special about them. It's only in its interrelationship with other parts of the world that this functional aspect becomes clear, and yet that is the very thing that makes life special. It's the fact that its parts have functional relationships amongst each other. So I'm going to posit that function is the hallmark of life. Things in living systems have purposes, whereas non-living stuff does not. And by living here, I'm including technology. I'll get to why in a moment. Mm-hmm. Now, this functionalist view is very closely married to the philosophies, if you want to think about them that way, of the founders of computer science, of Alan Turing, John von Neumann, and all of that crew. Remember that Turing, invented the abstractions, which here have been actually physically built. This is a Turing machine built by Mike Davey in 2010. The abstractions that define what computing is. And so, when Turing talked about function, he meant, he was a mathematician. He meant literally mathematical function. This idea of a mathematical function and a device that can implement that function are very closely related to functionalism in the sense that I just described, because the whole point behind Turing machines and universal Turing machines is that the function is independent of the substrate. Turing's point was that implementing a function was multiply realizable, and in particular, not only could you make a Turing machine out of anything, in this case, electric motors and Sharpies, and actually a little Arduino in the bottom. But you could equally well make it out of steampunk components the way Babbage did, or out of anything else, and it's still a Turing machine. It doesn't matter as long as it carries out this function, and it'll evaluate the same function. In particular, if, for instance, you have a Turing machine that implements a four-function calculator, if I now simulate that Turing machine by taking its code and putting it into a universal Turing machine implemented on a steampunk machine, for instance, then it's still a calculator. The point of a calculator is that it's a functional thing. It doesn't matter how it's being implemented or how many layers of indirection are there. Okay, so that's a computational perspective, and let me also give you a physics perspective. So life is causal. And this is something that was really emphasized by the founders of cybernetics. So, they looked, at things like thermostats as minimal examples of causal feedback systems. So, as I'm sure you all know, a thermostat has a temperature sensor and a switch. The old-fashioned ones have these mercury tilt switches connected to the strip, the temperature sensing strip that sort of tilts the switch back and forth. And that switch actuates a heater. So the point here is that temperature causes the switch to change, which causes the heater to turn on or off, which causes the temperature to change. So there is a feedback loop here. Without that causal idea, there is no way of talking about what a thermostat is. And all of life consists of such feedback loops. We have thermostats in our own bodies. That's how we maintain our temperature, as well as maintaining zillions of other parameters. So life makes no sense except in the light of causality. Now, causality, remember, is A causes B. Doesn't necessarily say that not A will cause not B. We don't know what not A will cause, but when there's A, then afterward there is B. It's not the same thing as just correlation, where we say A and B co-occur. Correlation doesn't even require time. We can think about correlations in an image, or correlations in time, but just A co-occurs with B and not A co-occurs with not B is not causality. And this is important because for causality you need an arrow of time. You need the idea that the thermostat is going to turn on, and then the heat will rise. And that arrow of time is a little bit of a mystery, because if you look at all of the basic laws of physics, so Newton's equation, Maxwell's equations, Einstein's equations, relativity, quantum mechanics, field theory, relativistic quantum mechanics, all of these are symmetric with respect to the arrow of time. They run the same way, whether time is going forward or backward. So where does causality come from? How do we get causality in a physical universe? The standard answer to this is that it's statistical. It comes from thermodynamics. So if you're watching a pool table and you see this happen, you know that we're watching the pool table backwards in time. And the reason you know that is because we're going from a high entropy state to a low entropy state. And that looks like a pool break in reverse. If the pool balls were just bouncing around, at equilibrium, then you would have no way of telling whether we're going forward in time or backward in time, because the bounces would all work either way. So this is the thermodynamic answer. But I think that there is another answer, which is the computational answer. If you have any system that performs a computation, and a thermostat is a minimal example of that, because it's got a write operation, if you like, and an if-then operation. Those are the ingredients that you make a programming language out of. Then there's causality in a system like this one. Clearly, you can implement a thermostat, in a world run by physics. So what's going on here? Well, this gets to a pretty profound question of when does a physical system compute? And this question, was addressed pretty nicely in 2023 by Dominic Horstman et al. In this paper, When Does a Physical System Compute? It's addressed even better, by the way, in a 2024 paper by a researcher at Harvard who works on quantum computing and the theory of computing more broadly, whose name will occur to me in just a second. But anyway, I'm using the Horstman paper because of this diagram, which I like. The point here is that the physics on the bottom of a computer, which involves voltage changes and wires and so on, there's some Hamiltonian of that. That is a reversible system. So that can be described purely in terms of the laws of physics. But there is some mapping that we can make, some RT. That mapping will bring us from this physical system to a computational state diagram on the top. So that's a different system. And in that system, these gates are computing the sum of, in this case, 0, 1 and 1, 0 to give us 1, 1. And the point about that computational system, which has a forward mapping from a physics RT and a backward mapping R tilde T, is that it's irreversible. When you do these computations, you don't know when you get to 1, 1 that it was 0, 1 and 1, 0 that got added together. It could have been 0, 0 and 1, 1. So all you need in order to get a computer is to have a physical system such that you can construct a parsimonious mapping, RT, and its inverse, to get the computation that it does. And the properties of the physical system can now be very different from the properties of the computational system. So there is a coarse graining needed on the physical system in order to understand it as a computer. The fact that RT has to be parsimonious, by the way, is really important here, because otherwise you could just say, a turbulent river is computing anything you like, and you just grow the mapping, as complex as you want in order to define whatever your computation is. So you need a parsimonious mapping that doesn't, grow with the size of the computation. There's a deep relationship between this view of computation and the thermodynamic view that I just described with the billiard balls, and that deep connection is actually it gives rise to things like the Landauer limit, the fact that irreversible computation requires an input of free energy, and therefore increases the entropy of the system. So the entropic and free energy implications of computation come directly from constructing this mapping carefully, and then you can see that computation and thermodynamics are actually very closely related. That in fact you can just extend thermodynamics to include the theory of computation when you do this. So this gives us an interesting picture in which we start to think about causality in terms of irreversible operations and computational operations in particular. Now, when irreversible things happen in the physical world, like say a boulder rolling down a hill that's going to squish a car at the bottom, we don't generally think about that as being purposeful or having agency. We don't say that the boulder, is an agent that is chasing, that car, or about to squash the car on purpose. And we don't, in fact, impute agency to this situation at all, unless there is, maybe a person or a robot at the top that tipped the boulder. So when do we go from causality to purpose, and how does that work? Well, I think that there is a really nice clue as to how that can come about, how agency can arise in a causal world. First of all, how causality arises, and then how agency arises in the Daisyworld Fable. So Daisyworld, for anyone who doesn't know, is a sort of a model built by James Lovelock and A.J. Watson in 1983, Lovelock of the Gaia hypothesis. So, the Gaia hypothesis that holds the whole Earth is a living system was first proposed by Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, who will come up in a moment, in the 1970s. And the Daisyworld parable or fable goes as follows. So imagine a planet like the Earth, in orbit around a sun like ours. You implement some simple geophysics. So the sun, sunlight is coming, and warming the planet. But in implementing those physics, you have to consider the albedo of the planet. So now let's assume that the planet has two species of daisies, and that's it, no other life forms. There are black daisies and white daisies, and they both have an optimal reproductive temperature of 72 degrees, so nice room temperature. And if the temperature deviates from 72 degrees, then their ability to reproduce falls off. And until it's too hot or too cold, they stop being viable altogether. Now, the interesting thing is that if you now vary the luminosity of the sun by a factor of 2, you actually find that this planet will self-regulate its temperature to stay right close to that sweet spot of 72 degrees by varying the number of black and white daisies. Remember, the black daisies will absorb sunlight and heat the planet. The white daisies will reflect sunlight, and the planet will get cooler. So, in other words, this world acts like a thermostat. And it regulates the temperature of the planet, and that seems really mysterious at a dynamical systems level. Like, why, when we construct this world with black and white daisies, do we get a thermostat? It's not so mysterious if you think about it from an evolutionary or niche shaping perspective. Basically, what we're looking at here is a situation in which you've got two reproductive systems that can influence the environment in ways that will either result in more of them or less of them. And whenever you have a situation like that, where something's existence depends on a variable that its population will in turn affect, you get this effect. You get essentially thermostats assembling out of arbitrary dynamical systems. This is kind of evolutionary cybernetics. It shows you how thermostat-like behavior emerges just from selection. In this case, of course, there's a single planet, but what's being selected is the black and white daisies. So this kind of situation shows us how something that can help create the conditions for its own continued existence is stabler, that is likelier to continue to exist, than something that cannot. That's really the moral here. And the corollary is that life creates the environment for life. In a way, that's what life is. It's the thing that continues to exist, in part because it not only does it act in order to propagate itself, but it acts on the world in order for that world to be friendly for its continued propagation of itself. So is this purposive? Is there agency here? Maybe there are the beginnings of agency or purposiveness here. I think that this shows you how agency or purpose arise from pure dynamics. So the moral of this part is I don't think that life makes sense except in the light of causality. So life is inherently causal. It has to cause itself to continue to exist. It has to cause things to happen in the environment. It has agency, if you like. And so you need causality for life. And causality makes no sense except in the light of function and computation. That computational mapping is how you introduce an arrow of time and thereby causality. It's the if-then. So in this view, computation is not an engineering discipline at all. It's not the technological discipline of how we make computers as we began doing in 1945. It's actually the science of causality. And in that framing, I owe a debt to Hector Cenil, who has done a bunch of work on Kolmogorov complexity. So computation as the science of causality and life as a computational system. Now, to really hammer home this point of life as a computational system, I'll bring one final piece of one final exhibit here, which is von Neumann's alternative view of computation. So in the 1940s, von Neumann was doing work as a theoretical biologist because he did everything. Turing also was a very important early figure in theoretical biology. Both of their contributions to that field are far less well known than their contributions to other fields. In von Neumann's case, game theory, quantum mechanics, in both of their cases, computer science. But here's what von Neumann was thinking about. He was wondering how a system like say a robot made out of Legos that is floating around on a pond where there are lots of loose Legos, how could it possibly assemble those Legos into another robot like itself? That's, of course, what every bacterium has to do in order to reproduce. It's what every mother has to do in order to give birth. And it seems, on the face of it, kind of paradoxical. It's like lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. How can you make something as complex as you yourself are? Well, what von Neumann realized is that in order for that to work, you have to have a tape, an instruction tape inside yourself that has the instructions for building a me. And you have to have what he called a universal constructor, which is a machine that can follow along on that tape and assemble the parts as it instructs in order to make a me. You also have to have a machine that will copy the tape so that your offspring will also have a copy of that tape. And finally, the instructions for building the tape copier and the universal constructor have to be themselves on the tape. If those things all hold, then you have a robot that can reproduce. But the really critical insight here is that the universal constructor, this machine that chunks along and builds things, is exactly a universal Turing machine. It's a universal computer. And that tells you right away that anything that can reproduce is also doing universal computation, which is a remarkable insight. It's basically saying that biology and computer science are the same field. And this is something that I don't think that most biologists appreciate, that the systems they're studying are computational, or that most computer scientists appreciate that what they make is actually artificial life in a sense. So that's a bit of a weird thing to think about, but it tells you that all life has to be computational. Now, it's embodied computation, and this is actually a key difference between the way Turing thought about computation and von Neumann thought about computation. In Turing's case, with the Turing machine, the symbols that head writes on the tape as it moves left and right along the tape, and reads, writes, and erases symbols according to a table of rules, those symbols are not made out of the same stuff as the tape and the head and the table of rules. So in that sense, a Turing machine can't build another Turing machine. But and that's what I mean by disembodied computation. But in von Neumann's case, the system that he designed to test out these ideas about the self-replication of machines was actually cellular automata. So this is kind of grid worlds in which there's a physics in which every grid changes its state based on the states of the neighboring 8 cells. And so, you can think of every grid as being as having a minimal physics. Every grid cell is having a minimal physics, and in that world, an appropriately configured machine, which is to say a configuration of cells, can actually print out another copy of itself. So a self-replicating machine is literally, creating another computer. So this is like the difference between, a computer with a 3D printer that can print another computer versus, my phone, which is Turing complete as a Turing machine, but it can't squirt another phone out the bottom. So it requires embodied computation in order to be able to reproduce, meaning the symbols that you're writing as the universal computer are not just abstract symbols, but they're literally the same atoms that you yourself are made out of. And that's that sense of embodiment is critical, but it's still computation in exactly the Turing sense. Okay, so now I want to interrupt please at will. I can't see anybody, so just break it.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the previous slide.
Of
So why
course.
is it important, or why is it that life would prefer this model of computation with the universal constructor rather than some other more trivial restricted model of self-replication, which is just like, let's say you're in a dynamical system and you just find like an attractor loop which creates other similar attractor loops, and it
Yeah.
doesn't have any universality to it, and it's just like a super simple self-replicating process. I mean,
Yeah,
people
yeah,
like this kind of
that's a great
principle
question.
in like even in like simple systems like linear. So why
Yeah,
is this idea of universality so
so
important
important.
in life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So first of all, as I'll discuss in a little bit, in an arbitrary universe that just has some laws of physics, Daisyworld type things will happen that will result in exactly what you say, in systems that can sustain themselves through just dynamically stable cycles but that are not Turing complete. That will happen, and that's easier than making a universal computer. So that is a first step. But the thing about having a universal constructor is that that's what allows for arbitrary changes in that tape to result in changes in all of the offspring. It allows evolution to occur, open-ended evolution to occur. So there are plenty of systems on Earth or in physics that can kind of replicate themselves sort of trivially, like a crystal seed, that makes more crystal, when you put it in a solution, but it's closed-ended. There may be a few kinds of changes you can make to that seed, like a snowflake, right, that will result in in changes in the offspring, but it's going to be a very, very limited set, and so you have a limited set of things that can happen from an evolutionary standpoint. So those non-Turing complete things will certainly happen first, but the benefit of a Turing complete universal computer is that at that point you're able to evolve in an open-ended way, and my my own way of thinking about the origin of life as opposed to just autocatalytic systems is that it is the emergence of general computation, which allows for open-ended evolution. And I'll show you how that occurs in just a moment.
Yeah, I see. That's very cool. It's also, I guess, related to like evolvability, right? These systems
Exactly.
which are in this universal sense, they're much more evolvable, and they'll outcompete the non-universal systems over
Precisely.
timescales.
Precisely. They have the benefit of evolvability, exactly. And I just want to point out that I find it really remarkable that von Neumann figured all this out in the late 40s, before the structure and function of DNA had been discovered, which is indeed exactly that Turing tape, or the ribosome, which is exactly that universal constructor, or DNA polymerase, which is exactly that tape replicator, both of which are encoded on DNA as well. So he got this totally right, despite the fact that he never set foot in a lab and did it from pure theory.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So I was want to ask exactly the same question as Akashi, but so follow up your point that evolvable is a key reason why it has to be universal. So I just wondering why biological system evolved to have such a universal generator, a universal property. And I also heard some people found that universality in the physical world is a very low threshold thing. It's really easy to get that thing. But yeah, my question is about still about why this thing evolved to be evolvable.
I think I think I'm gonna show why and how that occurs. So if you hold that question for a little bit, I think that's where I'm going to go. If it's still not, if there's still an aspect of it that's not clear, then then please break in again. But yeah, I'll explain.
Tani, did you want to ask something? I thought you had your hand up.
No, I rose it by accident, but thank you. I'm still interested to see where the thread is going. So please continue. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm now going to show you some artificial life experiments that I began doing in 2023, and that my team has been working on, especially over the summer. But I'm gonna show you just the early experiments and a bit of theory that around those early experiments. So this is still unpublished. The phenomenology is published in a paper from summer of last year, but there's the theory is not yet published. But anybody who wants a copy of this, I'm happy to send it. Okay, so these artificial life experiments are based on a Turing complete language called brainfuck that was invented by Urban Müller in 1993. The name is not my fault. Brainfuck is has only 8 instructions, and the reason I chose it is that it's very closely modeled on a universal Turing machine. So you can see here the program for Hello World. It's a little tricky to figure out why that prints Hello World, but it does. Here is what the 8 instructions actually do. So one of them will move the head 1 step to the right, one will move the head 1 step to the left, One will increment the byte under the head. One will decrement the byte under the head. So, it's a head that moves back and forth along a one-dimensional array of bytes. One will output the byte under the head to the console. One will input the byte under the head from the console. And then there are the jump instructions. Open bracket will jump to the corresponding close bracket if the byte under the head is 0. And close bracket will jump to the matching open bracket if the byte under the head is non-zero. And that's it. That's the whole language. So, you can write Microsoft Windows in that, or Emacs, if you have tons and tons of patience. I don't recommend trying to write anything in this language, but it is Turing complete. So I made a modification to brainfuck to make it a von Neumann language rather than a Turing language. So in other words, instead of the console, there is basically a second head on the same tape. And other than that, I left things alone. And then the setup consists of 1,000. This experiment was actually with 8,192, but you can do this just as well with 1,000. The data I'll show you is with 1,000 tapes. So there are 1,000 tapes in a soup. These tapes begin filled with random bytes. And the tapes are of length 64. So when you have a tape filled with random bytes of length 64, it will only, on average, have 1 or 2 actual instructions on it. Remember, there are 8 ops, there are 8 instructions, and there are 256 possible byte values. So only 1 in 32 of them, or on average a couple, will be instructions at all. So this is showing you, a bunch of those tapes in their initial state where I'm writing only the ops and leaving the no ops blank. Now the procedure consists of taking 2 of these tapes out of the soup, concatenating them so they're stuck end to end, and running. And just running the head along that pair of tapes, and then pulling the tapes back apart and putting them back in the soup, and then repeating. And you repeat that procedure again and again. Now, in the beginning, nothing much is going to happen because there's only a couple of operations on each tape. Those operations are arbitrary, so only 2 operations will run per interaction, and you won't see very much happen. But if you let this go, if you let this process keep going for millions of steps, something really cool happens. So here it is running on my laptop. And after a few million interactions, you start to see structure emerge, and then complex programs, and then the programs become even more complex. And so this is kind of an amazing result, because what you see is meaningful, structured programs that are doing something emerging from pure noise and interaction. So here you can see in this particular run, after about 8 million interactions, the number of ops per interaction has risen from 2 to 4,784. So it's very computationally intense suddenly, and we know kind of what these programs have to be doing. We know that because what you're seeing here is actually a histogram of the contents of those tapes. The original values of the histogram are just 1 everywhere, because a random tape will always be different from all of the other tapes. But when this soup has matured, you see a lot of copies of this top one. In this case, again, this was an 8,192 tape soup, so 5,000 of the top one, 297 of the next, 99 of the next. So it's a kind of long-tailed distribution of tapes with different contents, all of which appear to be copying themselves and each other. So this is pretty cool, and it's exactly the emergence of these universal copiers that has taken place from an environment that initially was just capable of doing computation, but it was just random bytes. So we go from here to here, flat distribution, only a few instructions and 2 operations per interaction, to a very long-tailed distribution of tapes with thousands of operations per interaction and a lot more code on the tapes. It's pretty cool. And this is what that phase transition looks like. So this is a scatter plot with 10 million points. Each point is an interaction. The x-axis is time, and you can see that in this case, this phase transition occurs right at 6 million interactions. I'm calling it a phase transition because that's what it looks like. The vertical axis here is the number of operations that run in each interaction. You can see that the number of operations just skyrockets. And the other interesting indicator is that the compressibility of the soup becomes much greater at that moment. So we start off with an incompressible soup. It's like a Turing gas that is incompressible, and at that moment of transition, the soup becomes highly compressible because now suddenly you have lots of copies of everything. So, following Walter Fontana, I would call the phase of matter on the left a Turing gas. Gas because every byte is decorrelated from every other byte. So there's the correlation function, it's the delta function, and the phase of matter on the right is not a standard phase of matter. It's not a liquid or a solid or a crystal. It might be what Schrödinger called an aperiodic crystal in his book What is Life, but I would call that phase of matter life. It's complex, it's compressible, but it has functional structure at every scale. It's not just repeats.
Could I ask a question here to make sure I'm following along? So you're doing a series. Each one of these is a computation. There's a series in time, right? And so each computation is leading to the next one. Is that correct?
So there are two timescales here, if you like. There's interactions. So pulling two random tapes out of the soup, concatenating them, and running, and then putting them back in the soup is an interaction. So
Okay.
I'm showing you 10 million interactions. That's the x-axis, and for every interaction there is a point drawn, and the y position of the point is the number of operations that ran in that interaction. Remember, here I'm showing you, right, the average number of operations that run in the beginning is 2, because there are only, when you take two of these tapes and put them together, there are very few operations here, and generally, there are only 2 per tape. And there's likely to be a syntax error, for instance, when the first one you encounter is a closed bracket and there's no matching open bracket. And then when after this transition, there's a lot of computation happening, and that's what you see here. Does that make sense?
So yeah, okay. And so then I'm trying to figure out where the path dependence is coming from. So are there any constraints at all from one computation to the next?
The only thing that has changed is that when two concatenated tapes run, they can modify some other byte on the tape. Now, in general, at the beginning, those modifications are very minor. Like when there's a dot, that is a print or a copy operation, so that will copy a byte from one place to another, and whenever there is a plus or a minus, that will increment or decrement a byte. Whatever byte is.
So they're not only, you not only have a string of symbols here that are getting concatenated, they're executing the instructions as well.
Correct. And at the beginning, these self-modifications are random and are very few in number, because there are very few things that are even instructions, and only an instruction can do a modification. But by the end, you have these long strings copying each other.
So this is a little bit like Stuart Kaufman's light bulbs connected with wires, and
Yeah.
you get to a certain point and poof, it does something. Okay,
right.
gotcha. Thank you.
That's right.
Do you ensure the programs are halting at some point, or?
Oh, yes. Good question. If you don't impose a maximum number of operations or a stochastic probability of stopping, then you will inevitably run into a infinite loop. So you have to do one or both of those things.
Okay.
So
I just curious if you counting the total number of the non-halting or the something exceed your exceed your budget, does it also have some sudden change around the phase transition point?
It does. It does, and it'll become clear why in a moment. But yes, that's right. There, as you can see, even before this phase transition, there are points that are very high, and that's because of infinite loops. And so in this case, for making these plots, I used a stochastic stopping probability. But actually, in all of the and I did that for various reasons. But in all of the experiments that I'll show you from now on, I used 1,024 tapes rather than 8,192, and a fixed 10,000 operation maximum rather than a stochastic halting probability. And I did that because I wanted to remove all other sources of randomness. Okay, so the suggestion here is that pretty much any universe that has a source of randomness and can support computation will evolve life, if you grant that this kind of stuff is life. But there's a pretty big mystery here, which is why does the complexification happen? In particular, when you don't add any mutation. So I originally in this setup, in this system, I had originally introduced a mutation rate because I assumed that evolution requires is Darwinian, right? That you get mutation and selection, and so we would need to have like 1 in 10,000 times a byte flips to a random value or something. So there was a mutation rate originally, but when I started to vary the mutation rate to see what if in this moment of life cropping up, there is a relationship. The more mutation you add, the faster life comes up to a point, and then if you add too much mutation, then then you kind of break the system. But the shock was that even with a mutation rate of 0, you get this behavior, you get this phase transition. So that's really a puzzle. How can you get evolution with no mutation? So let's explore.
Can I briefly ask something?
Yeah, of course.
You do need some randomness within initialization, right? Because there might be some programs which cannot be combined in a way that you get reasonable results.
No, I allow every combination. So in the setup that I'm going to show you, the only randomness is in the random choice of 2 programs to combine. And
yes, but if you use the same program, for instance, to start with like a homogeneous pool, then you won't get anywhere, right? Or am I getting something fundamentally wrong?
We start off with all of the tapes filled with random bytes.
Yeah.
So the probability that 2 of them will be the same is effectively 0.
Yes. Okay.
And we pick 2 without replacement, so it's always a different one.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, why does complexification happen without mutation is kind of the weird thing. Now, first of all, as I think will be clear to all of you, by the end we have a replicating entity, and it can engage in standard population evolution dynamics. So it makes sense that should be a more stable point than the random bytes, because things that can replicate persist through time. But how do we get there in the first place? So I'm going to just sketch the math of this, and I'll try and skip over some stuff a little quickly because I know we're running low on time. But in normal, replication dynamics, you think about a kind of very general ansatz that looks like this. So you have a set of replicators, xi, and their rate of change is some function of their current populations. This is like a super general ansatz that works for everything from chemical kinetics to population ecology. An example of such a system is like the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey dynamics, which I'm sure many of you know about. Those look like this. So you've got 2 species. There is a prey species X1 and a predator species X2. And those terms correspond to reproduction and getting eaten for the prey, and eating in order to reproduce, and death for the predator. And then you'll get these oscillations. Now, this is a more general form of that Lotka-Volterra equation. So, notice over here that there are, alpha and gamma are linear, and they're the diagonal terms of a linear component, and beta and delta are bilinear, right? They've got a product of x1 and x2. So this is just a general form of that, where R is the first order term, and the second order, the bilinear term, is parameterized by M and B. And here's how you'd fill those in. There are no off-diagonal terms in R in Lotka-Volterra, because in the Lotka-Volterra system, you can't get the prey turning into a predator or the predator turning into a prey. So you have only diagonal terms. I hope this makes sense. Now, the key thing here is that the linear part gives you reproduction and death and metamorphosis, predator turning to prey, prey turning to predator, which is not present here. And the bilinear part gives you predation, competition, and finite niches. That's what limits the system and prevents these numbers from just blowing up to infinity. Okay, now we know that this can't be the whole story of evolution because it's closed-ended. In a system like Lotka Volterra, you're never going to develop a third species. And the whole point behind evolution is how do you get more species to arise? How do you get complexity out of such a thing? Well, the answer, I think, comes from an idea introduced by Merezhkovsky in the beginning of the 20th century and popularized by Lynn Margulis, which is symbiogenesis. So symbiogenesis is when two living things come together to make a new living thing. And the question is, could symbiogenesis be happening in BFF? The answer is it does. And the way you can see that it happens is by looking at the populations of all replicating strings in the soup from the very beginning. And by all replicating strings, I include strings as short as length 1. I mentioned that there are certain instructions, like the dot instruction print will basically print whatever's under head 1 onto head 2. So that's already a 1-byte replicator, if you want to think about it that way. And that's this first one that arises all the way at the left. And what you see is more and more replicating strings that have faster and faster rise times and decay times until this phase transition, which here happens at about 3.8 million interactions. And when you look at those replicating strings and you track them closely, what you find is that the later replicating strings are combinations of the earlier replicating strings. In other words, if you have weak replicators that are replicating just single bytes now and then, once in a while, two of those will end up together, and then they'll replicate as a group. So there's a merger tree of replicators, and that's what results in these big complex programs. So it is symbiogenesis that drives the evolution. So can we build symbiogenesis into an ansatz like the one that I just described? You can, and you can do it with the trick of Marian Smolchowski, a statistical physicist, who described a system which he called coagulation dynamics. Also in the early 20th century. So coagulation dynamics is originally the statistical physics of things like forming scabs or gelatin, where you have monomers that can come together to make dimers. Dimers can come together to make quadrimers, or whatever you call them, and so on. So it's polymerization, and this is just the Smolchowski coagulation equation. It's really just bookkeeping. It says that when you have I plus j turning into k, the clusters here are numbered by their size, then that reaction, that merging will happen proportional to the populations of I and j and to a merger kernel kij. And whenever such a merger happens, for bookkeeping, you have to then subtract the populations of the merging entities j and k. So that's merger gain and merger loss from everything that merged, getting removed from the population. So the cool thing is that Smolchowski showed that these equations, this equation for coagulation, produces a phase transition called gelation. It's a second-order phase transition, and that's exactly what happens when you put Jello in the fridge as liquid, and then it turns into a gel, overnight. That's that phase transition, and the order parameter is the size of the largest cluster. And basically, when that shoots to infinity and the whole thing turns into gelatin, that's gelation, and that is exactly what is happening in the artificial life simulation. So basically, as these little replicators stick together, and they appear to do so faster and faster, as you can see from the increasing or the decreasing timescales, eventually they all glom together, and you get gelation. So it literally is a phase transition. It's Smolchowski gelation. So if you put those two terms together, one for replication and one for symbiogenesis, you have a general set of equations for replicators. And in particular, the R part is closed-ended, it's normal population dynamics, but the K part life forms out of the existing ones. And that gives you open-endedness. So here is a more worked out version of the replication part of the linear and bilinear part for the artificial life system that I was just showing. The reason that it has this particular form is that I'm giving you the general linear part on the left with R, and the nonlinear part comes from the fact that when some code copies itself, it will overwrite some other code. And so I've introduced a an idea of niches, which is basically just which bytes do things overwrite. If one replicator lives in bytes 3 and 4 and another replicator lives in bytes 15 and 16, then no matter how much they copy each other, their niche overlap is 0. They won't compete. But if they copy themselves onto each other, if they overlap in their niches, then they will compete. One will overwrite the other. So you have this niche term. The symbiogenesis part is more complex than the Smolhovsky equations, but that's only because we have to account for more than 2 things coming together. You can have 3 or 4 or 17 replicators coming together. So you need kernels of arbitrary size, and you have to account for the possibility that the merged entity is actually a subset of the thing that got of the things that merged. It doesn't have to be all of those bytes. So that's what makes it look more complex, but it's just the same thing. So that's all of those together, the evolution part and the revolution part. And you can do a cool intervention in this system by tracking those mergers of replicators and by blocking certain mergers. So in this case, and this is the important experiment, and I'll conclude very soon. But here, what we do is you track the depth of the merger tree for every replicator that arises, and we block mergers that result in merger trees that are too deep. So these are depths limited by the yellow one is limited to depths of 128. Then you have the same behavior you had in the unclamped system. But if you limit depths to 9, for instance, you allow only mergers that are 9 deep, then you don't get gelation. And this involves only blocking maybe 1 in 1,000 events. So the top curves are how many events how many interactions do you have to block in order to prevent those entities from forming. And you can see that in the case of 9, it's not that many. It's only 1 in 1,000 of these interactions that result in these novel, deep, new entities. But that will prevent gelation from ever occurring. So in other words, the moral is these rare events are really important that result in symbiogenesis, and you need to have lots of symbiogenesis to get to these complex entities. Now, the cool thing about doing that blocking is that you can also do a perturbation analysis. This is what you get these populations of smaller replicators that plateau. They're well fit by logistic functions, and you can then look at how their populations are correlated with each other as they fluctuate up and down. You can see that sometimes they appear to be cooperating. The fluctuations go up and down together, like between the orange and the pink one. And sometimes they appear to be anti-correlated because they're competing for the same niche. And so by doing a bit of fluctuation analysis, linearizing the dynamics around that steady state, you can reconstruct the replication matrix. So here's what the replication matrix looks like for a typical one of these clamped runs. And you can see 3 features that are important. One is that the diagonal is dominant, and that tells you that mostly what's going on is replicators self-replicating, just like in Lotka-Volterra. But you also see off-diagonal parts that are negative and that are positive. The negative parts are largely symmetric about the diagonal, and that tells you that if A competes with B, then B also competes with A, right? So competition is mutual. But you also have positive components, and those off-diagonal positive components are asymmetric. So this is cooperation among replicators, and they're not symmetric. The fact that A helps B doesn't mean that B helps A. But A might help B, which helps C, which helps D, which comes back around and helps A, for instance. And it turns out that those complicated cooperations are indeed what takes place. I don't have time to explain the details, but basically, the higher you allow the merger depths to go, the more unstable the system becomes, the more ready to gelate. You can see those timescales becoming faster and faster. And that is basically a cooperative instability, where these replicators are becoming more and more cooperative with each other. They're more and more ready to make that jump to full gelation. So the moral of this story is that the R and K terms are related. They're not independent. You can see what is about to undergo symbiogenesis based on what is already cooperating. So symbiosis is what leads to symbiogenesis. It's almost as if symbiogenesis is just a relabeling symbiotic relationships. Lynn Margulis used to talk about, people as just bags of bacteria that are cooperating with each other. And I think she was right. We are cooperating bacteria, basically. This is the answer to the question about things that are not Turing complete becoming Turing complete later on. But basically, those replicating bytes are definitely not von Neumann replicators. The code that copies the byte is different from the byte itself. But after when things gelate, you get this fusion of the code and the thing that it copies, and what you end up with are these cellular replicators in which the code that does the copying is part of what is copied. So I call inanimate replicators here bytes that are completely disjoint from the code that does their copying. Viral replicators are times when the code that does the copying has an intersection with the code that is copied, but it's not fully contained. And cellular are cases where the code that does the copying is fully contained by the code that is copied. And basically what you can see is that right at the moment of gelation, cellular replicators take off. That's kind of what that moment of gelation really is. It's the emergence of von Neumann replication. Okay. So I want to just end by noting that there's lots of evidence that that biology works this way too. So this is just a breakdown of our genome from the 2001 Human Genome Project, and the surprise from this work was that only 1.5% of our genes code for the proteins that make us up, and that so much of it are these lines, signs, LTR retrotransposons, DNA transposons, sequence repeats, segmental duplications, and all of that stuff is basically viral or transposon replicators that are operating below the level of the entire genome or the entire organism. So, my view is that this is all evidence of our own genome having been constructed by subreplicators, viruses and things like them, as opposed to having arisen primarily through random mutation and selection. So in other words, we see evidence that, obviously mutation does happen and Darwinian selection does happen, but that symbiogenesis has actually been a huge part of the way we have evolved too. And there's, by the way, tons of papers in the last 10 years about how functional genes in our bodies have viral origins as well. So in this view, life is embodied autopoietic computation arising and complexifying through symbiogenesis. It's not just neuroscience that's computational. Life was computational from the start. It gets more computationally complex over time through symbiogenesis at many scales. And symbiogenesis makes that computation massively parallel. So that means that cooperative computational parallelism enables collective intelligence via a division of cognitive labor. There is an arrow of evolution here too, not just an arrow of time, whereby things become more complex and become more computationally sophisticated as those computers learn to interact and replicate together. And that's what intelligence scaling laws tell us. This is my final slide. So in this view, life and technology are the same, and there's an implication here that the kind of theory of complexity that many of us have been looking for is maybe not as far off as all that. We're doing a bunch of investigations of hierarchical Kolmogorov information that should give us, a Kolmogorov or algorithmic complexity view of how life becomes more complex. Essentially, every time things come together, you're adding bits of information regarding how they come together, and that's the origin of complexity in the code. And as far as Platonic ingressors go, if you think about dynamically stable cycles, whether of those very simple kinds or the kinds that start to interlock to form more complex replicators, if you do a Poincaré map of those things, then you turn those cycles into points, right? And those are, if you like, the identities of different possible Platonic ingressors. If you consider the symbiogenetic multiverse, right, of everything that could have combined, then that gives you a universe of possible things that combine together. And our contingent history is basically which ones have combined and resulted in what we've got today. And that results in open-endedness, right? The fact that every time you combine, you have a new basis for things to combine further. All right, phew, I'm sorry, I really tried to race there to get us there within an hour. I know that was a little bit too quick at the end to probably make sense. I don't know if we have any time for
Sure.
For additional questions, discussion. I can definitely hang out for a little bit.
That's great. Yeah, let's absolutely do that. Yeah, Douglas.
Hi. So from a biophysicist point of view, and somebody who's looked at evolution a lot, I like it all. It all makes sense to me. You were talking at the beginning about purpose and agency and cybernetics. And so you've shown now that you can get structure without a purpose, but cybernetics, the key thing is that there's a goal programmed in there somewhere. So are you saying that you don't really need it, or that there's an extrapolation from what you're talking about that will get us to goals?
Yeah, no. I think what I've shown is actually the emergence of purpose. So, in the same sense that, like, even when you look at a program that is replicating itself in others, right? That now has purpose. Its purpose is to replicate itself in others. If you break it, unlike a rock, right, by flipping a byte or something, it will no longer replicate. It's now broken. In the same sense that a kidney that has failed is broken. So, what I'm showing is the emergence of purpose out of a purposeless universe, if that makes sense.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
So you would say then the purpose is species survival, and then that will then generate sub goals of, like, getting into the car and driving into work and so forth.
Exactly.
Okay.
Purposes
All right.
lead to more purposes. Every time two things serve a function for each other, every time there's cooperation, you get a multiplication of purposes, if you like, right? There are more purposes emerge as things cooperate.
Okay, thanks.
Who's next?
Let's see, Akarsh.
Yeah, great talk. I also saw your talk at A-Life. I like both of them. My question was on basically the emergence of these Turing complete, like, universal constructors, because in your experiments, the Turing, like, the computation nature of it was kind of baked into the language of brainfuck, right? I was wondering, I've been doing a lot of experiments with, like, particles and, like, particle-based simulations, or like grid-based simulations. How do you how do you think that these different substrates, which don't have, like, computation in the traditional Turing sense baked into them, how can they emerge these universal constructors and life? I mean, that is the question of origin of life, but more concretely, is there, like, how do you see the progression from just particles to creating something like DNA that can do universal computation within, like, let's talk about a particle-based simulation specifically, I guess, to keep it concrete.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a great question. The number of physical universes in which you can build a computer is very large, right? That's a low bar. That's something that I think Wolfram and Cook et al. Have shown, in enumerating all of the possible cellular automata, for instance. So if you think about fundamental laws of physics that are really simple, that just involve, like, game of life type stuff, right? If three of my neighbors are black, then I turn black or something. There are many such. The majority of those, in some sense, perhaps, are capable of computation. So when you define a computer, there's always this question of how you are partitioning. What is the physics and what is the definition of the computer? So here I've made a kind of generous partition for where the physics includes an entire Turing complete language. But if you make the partition very, if you move that partition to a very different spot and you say, it's just a really simple cellular automaton, my point here is that you will still get, all of the phenomena that I just described. It's just those first steps involve, figuring out a set of patterns or of instructions that can engage in symbiosis together in order to generate a Turing complete language, which you then need to make a universal constructor. So
If I guess if the
it's
physics,
about how you course grain.
I see, if the physics bakes in less computation, then the life will have to evolve more to get that
Exactly.
mechanism. I see.
Exactly. So it's about starting a little way up the ladder where hidden in that set of things are 8 instructions that work together to make a Turing complete language, along with a whole bunch of bytes that don't do anything. But if you had just pixels that can fit together to make a machine that can work with other ones, it's the same process. You're starting a little lower on the ladder.
Okay, thank you.
All right, David.
I'm interested in the applications of this for bioelectric networks and how collections of cells might follow a purpose to build an organism, to build a part of an organism, to build an eye. Can you tell me how all this might be represented in a, or you know, how this could be represented in a bioelectric network, to sort of relate it to Michael Levin's work on this topic and the idea of agency and purpose in morphogenesis?
Well, one thing that it becomes clear when you look at stuff this way is that there is agency or purpose at every level of that symbiogenetic merger tree. So you know, I'm not sure I can relate. I can't relate it directly to the electrical morphogenesis stuff that Mike has been doing. Although I think we could build a bridge between those two. But if you take Mike's kind of fundamental point to be that we're not just like collections of mindless robots, but actually collections of things that are themselves intelligent, which are collections of things that are themselves intelligent, that are cooperating, right, in order to make the larger thing. Then I think this symbiogenetic perspective is very consistent with that view. And the fact that so much of what appears to have been our evolution is based on essentially infectious genes, right, or things that already had function that merged their way into us, as opposed to these random mutations, tells us that not only at the level of development, but also at the level of evolution, there is purposiveness, in the way those parts have combined. Just to give a random example, the placenta, is made possible by syncytin, which is actually a viral coat protein from a virus that endogenized, into our germline around the time that that mammals came on the scene. And in fact, there's a whole family of placental proteins that come from different viruses that have endogenized at various times. So, we are actively constructed, we didn't just randomly chance into being by simpler things.
All right, Hananel.
This is just a small technical question. I'm really surprised that you don't need a mutation. Somehow it's bothered me, and I'm asking, maybe the way that you started the machine is the randomness that I'm looking for in a way.
It's a great question. You absolutely need a source of randomness, and what's serving that function here is two things. First, we began with 1,000 times 64 random bytes, right? So there's 64,000 bytes. That's the endowment of initial noise, if you like. Now, that's not enough on its own to for there to be like a complex self-replicating program in there. But it is essential because it's enough for there to be 1 byte replicating programs somewhere in there. And if you don't have those, then you can't get off the ground. The other source of randomness that's really critical is the random selection of 2 tapes out of the soup to combine. That random selection will once in a while result in a conjunction of things that work together and stick. So you can think of the complexity of the code that arises as being the fossilized choices that worked, right? So it's a different version of mutation, basically, where things colliding, right? Things happening to collide that work are are actually the basis for the complexity of the Kolmogorov complexity of what comes out the other end. So it's not mutation in the conventional sense, but it is a chance-based building up of complexity.
Right. Okay. So if you would start, I don't know, 60 tapes, copy of the same one, you will not get any advancement.
Right. That's right. And nothing would happen. And by the way, you can think of mutation as just being more symbiogenesis, right? You can think of it as being, if you like, the introduction into the soup of single bytes that enter into symbiogenesis that may or may not work with the larger thing. Those can be productive. Sometimes they can speed it up, but the point is that larger things combining are more powerful. Which is why it's not that it becomes a less and less important driver as you get further along in evolution.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Let's see, Akash.
Yeah, I was wondering, so since brainfuck captures this idea of like symbiogenesis so well and like the origin of life almost, what would happen if you just ran the system for like trillions of steps in like a really
Yeah,
big grid? Do you expect like open-ended evolution
great question.
in the way that we
I,
want it to just come out of it? And if
yeah,
so,
that's a really.
we should be investing a lot of compute into this,
I
right?
agree.
Just to see
I
what happens.
agree. It won't work as it is, and the reason is twofold: space and energy. So the limitation BFF gets us. You're right. It points the path toward open-endedness, because you can imagine, like, I could just keep combining things together, right, and get more and more complexity. But it's this particular setup is limited for two reasons. One of them is that the tapes are fixed of length 64. And there's no structure among the tape. They can't form any higher order structures, because it's just a random soup. There's no ability for these things to form larger compartments. The other limitation, by the way, is on number of computing steps, right? So there's an energy limitation too. So we need to redesign the BFF setup in a way that allows those programs to create larger niches and to combine into larger and larger structures beyond that limit of 64. And then I think we'll have something open-ended, and then that will be a very interesting experiment indeed to do. So that's an active area of work. But if you have ideas about how to change it to make it open-ended, all that are different from mine, I'm all ears. But yes, it does point the path toward open-endedness, and I agree those are very interesting experiments to do.
Doug.
Yeah, two comments that might help bridge the computer science world and the biology world. One is there's a literature in cancer biology where people were looking at genome rearrangements in cancer cells. And then what they would do is clone out the individual progeny. To make a long story short, what happens is, for many passages, you get all kinds of rearrangements, but eventually it settles into one arrangement, and there are no changes after that. It's just stable. And which final one you settle on depends on which lineage you look at. So there are lots of possible solutions, but there's an evolution towards a stable changes of the kinds, large-scale kinds of things that you're talking about. The other one is a beautiful paper which I have looked for. I can't find, about 25 years ago in Nature, and they were asking how wasps build nests. And so this has to do with your embodied computation. And what happens is the wasp brain doesn't know what a wasp nest looks like. What happens is it lands on a partially built nest, and if it sees a wall over here, it spits there. If it sees a wall over there, it spits there. And the net algorithm of the existing nest plus the wasps creates a nest.
That's very cool, and similar in many ways to how morphogenesis works inside the body, probably, during development. So it's a kind of external development. All right, apologies.